this section is on basically the changing climate politics in the US in the trade union movement. And I just wanted to get up on the screen in a moment a few images which I think sort of captures what is the framework for progressive trade union climate policy. I just want to preface that little presentation with a couple of historical points. I think anybody who's been following the climate change issue will know that this has been a really tough issue for US unions. They did not support, for the most part, the Kyoto Treaty. They were the only national labor center in the world of any significance that didn't support it. And they didn't support it for a reason. And it was because they feared that it would lead to an outsourcing of jobs to other countries who were not carbon constrained. The US was being asked to sign a treaty to reduce its emissions, quite modestly, as a matter of fact. But countries like China, which were classed as developing countries back in the early 90s, were not asked to do the same. And there were obviously unions in heavy industry in particular, and construction, who felt that that was unfair. But so the issues around the US trade union politics on this were always basically cast in terms of the unions in carbon-intensive sectors, who largely faced up with other unions who may have wanted to have a different policy, but didn't have a skin in the game or a sense that there was anything to be gained by taking on unions who had a different policy. So that was the situation up until about 2007, 2008. Then what happens, we have the Blue-Green Alliance was launched, and we started to change the conversation that there's a possibility for job creation and also climate protection and a general greening of the economy. What has happened since is very revealing. We touched on it this morning. The Obama stimulus package was the sort of the high point of green investments in the US. This was a sign of a sea change towards a greening of the economy, a real commitment on climate. Since then, basically, the president has backtracked on a lot of that stuff. He's been beaten into submission by Congress, and the fossil fuel industries are now, the coal, oil, and gas, have been talking in terms of a great new age for North American coal, oil, and gas. We saw it in the Canadian discussion earlier. And they're now talking in terms of Sodai America, and the idea that we've got enough here, and it's couched in the name of jobs and energy independence. The truth is that there's a number of unions in the US who have gone along with this agenda, not implicitly, but explicitly. So we've got an issue where some unions are largely supporting more and more extraction, more and more fossil fuel infrastructure, and that's a challenge we face as a movement here in the US and also a shade of it internationally. So what I want to try to do is just point to 5 images which I think frames a progressive agenda or a response to a rather defensive narrative. I don't want to single out the United Mine Workers, but this was a kind of symptom of the industry basically enlisting the union in defense of coal, in the case of coal. But this is true in other industries as well. So it's not singling out a particular union. And as you can see in this poster, which goes back a few years now, it was in opposition to the climate agreement, saying that jobs would suffer. So one thing we have to do, I think, is if we're going to have a progressive policy in US labor, is to be independent of business interests, but also, I think it's important to add, independent of some of the mainstream environmental groups that largely don't really give much concern to workers. It's renewable energy by any means necessary. If that means a multinational coming in and doing it at a high cost, that's too bad. So workers are left out of it. So we need an independent trade union position and a set of solutions. The next is, as we said this morning, and I don't think it requires too much of additional language, is it has to be science-based. The science is clear. We've talked about it. But again, unions in the US have been slow to accept the science. It's not that they reject the science. They just look at the targets for emissions reductions and say, that ain't never going to happen. Or we'll try to do a little bit of reduction. Even the Obama administration they conveniently moved the goalposts. Instead of having 1990 figures, which is the internationally recognized benchmark for emissions, they moved it to 2005. Very convenient. And then they say, well, we're reducing our emissions based on 2005 levels. And that's largely the date that a lot of US unions have gone along with, because it makes the challenge of emissions reductions look a little bit easier. So we have to stick to the science. If the policy and the organizing isn't consistent with the science, then that's a really, really serious problem. The international trade union movement is united pretty much on the need to respect the science-based targets. So the US, I think, can go in that direction. This is an obvious point, but it's actually an important one. In the context of climate change, internationalism is huge. We know about the effects on the global south and on workers of the global south and communities there, but also on the policy level, there's been a tendency in the US labor movement to parrot the State Department position in the negotiations. I don't have time to go into details on that. But the State Department is holding out for a voluntary agreement, not a mandatory agreement. It's holding out for the best you can do, not any legally binding reductions. And what has tended to happen is some unions in the US wanting to stay in with the administration for other reasons, not just climate, have largely gone along with the State Department role. So at a time when the whole world labor movement was deeply distressed by the Copenhagen Accord in 2009, there was more than a few letters going into the State Department saying, you did a great job for American workers. So I think this is a real challenge. The important point, though, also is the solutions we propose have to fix the problem or go some large way towards fixing the problem. We cannot do this without major restructuring of political economy, particularly in the carbon-intensive sectors, which are energy, transport, food and agriculture, buildings, and so on. We can do this, but we have to realize the extent of the challenge. It has to be transformational. And finally, it must inspire and reach the members. If members are not going to be out in the streets for a few green jobs for some industry over there, when they know it's not going to solve the problem, it's not going to help us build the movement, we have to connect this issue to the core trade union agenda so that climate and environment and workers' rights, worker protections, workers' living standards become a part of an inseparable, joined-up, holistic narrative that we can take to members and get them active on this issue in a context of a broader set of issues and a new agenda for social change. So I offer these as a sort of a principles or pillars for a new international, a new approach to climate change from the US labor movement. It's certainly many of these pillars have been adopted already by unions around the world, and that's increasing. So without any further ado, I want to hand it over, I think, to Fernando first. Fernando Lozada from Collective Bargaining from National Nurses United, who's the head of collective bargaining and a strong advocate for climate justice within that union. Then after that, we go to Chris Erickson from the IBEW Local 3. And I'm sorry, I did it the other way around. I'm sorry. We want to start with Judy from New York State Nurses Association, Bruce Hamilton, Amalgamated Transit Union, Chris Erickson from Local 3 IBEW, and finally, Fernando Lozada.
So thank you, Sean. I also want to recommend for any union here that's not a member of TUED, Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, NYSNA becoming involved has really, the New York State Nurses Association, the union I'm president of, really has learned a lot and experienced wonderful things by being part of this organization. I strongly recommend unions joining it. I want to give a special shout out to our own Sean Petty for bringing it forward to the board. That was a very exciting day when that happened. You know, Sean raises, our Sean here, Sean Sweeney, a lot of Seans, raises those 5 key areas, right, for which we should focus our energies, excuse the expression, as we build this movement that has to be independent, science-based, internationalist, transformative, and engaged members. I want to talk a little bit about engaging members. If our members aren't engaged around an issue, if they're not embracing an issue and see it as integral to their day-to-day lives, what is our purpose? I mean, who do we represent? We're leaders, but where are the members? Do our positions as elected leaders or even appointed staff, do they permit us to speak for our members if our members aren't rallying around what we're saying? Or, importantly, if they haven't been involved in the discussions that lead us to these conclusions, at least on some level? By virtue of our ability to access a world of information that's not so accessible to our members, have we done due diligence in transmitting that information and allowing for some interchange around some of these, to workers in this country at least, unconventional ideas? I'm always amazed when I hear workers and unions from other countries talk about the level of development of their unions. Those of us who are here know it's very different. Kind of sad. I call it the de-intellectualization of our country sometimes. So we make these proposals and draft resolutions and have positions. We lobby for legislation, and we even put out literature decrying what's going on with the fossil fuelies and the climate deniers, and submit the scientific data, and we add our names to these academic publications, explain about why public ownership and control of utilities is integral to a rational energy policy. This is still kind of a heady concept for members who don't work for the public sector and who, and even for those who do. Of course, we have internal debates and conferences with activists all over the world, like we're doing now. But how do we forge a significant presence at these international energy activities? And these things are not insignificant. All of our activities matter, and they have the ability to diffuse into other spheres in which our members do integrate. But I think the challenge before us is, how do we make this issue connect to the fabric of our members' lives, particularly those of us in unions that aren't directly connected to energy production or utilities, like my own, a union of 37,000 registered nurses. It's very difficult to awaken passion about an issue that doesn't directly affect people at the moment. That's what we found. Sure, there's sympathy, there's concern on many levels around an issue, but connecting climate oppression to the daily oppressive conditions that workers face, and understanding, having our workers understand the same forces responsible for making their lives miserable at work, that cut benefits, that privatize the public sector, that contract out in all sectors, that standardize service sector practices like testing, scripting, and de-skilling, that alter laws that protect unions, whatever it is, they are the very people destroying our planet and then proceeding to deny there's a problem. Many green jobs programs, and not to denigrate some well-intentioned folks' efforts, and I certainly have been misquoted before. I'm trying to be a little careful here. I don't know, those of you who are witness to that experience I had, appear to be meaningful. These are significant things, and that sometimes do improve the status quo. This incremental kind of stuff is nothing to sneeze at. But unfortunately, as been said here before, it tends to avoid addressing or acknowledging the principal problems plaguing our environment and society. The problems that plague our unions in the U.S. and the posture that so many unions have adopted in our country provide the backdrop of why we don't have a progressive united energy democracy platform. The labor community is atomized. The coalitions we create are either single issue oriented or held together by tenuous and very narrow criteria. Again, I want to emphasize that these coalitions have meaning: fighting fast track, losing that one, for example, or for the $15 minimum wage. Obviously, these battles, when they're successful, improve the quality of life of workers. And when they're not successful, I think they help to illustrate the sham of our democracy and that uber wealthy class that's in control. But many of our unions don't challenge the nature of the beast, the development of capitalism as it exists today, and the impact of its trajectory in our country and around the world. We tend to be complacent rather than combative. Labor still ties our hopes to the Democratic Party here, hoping that at least a promise or two might be kept. And we keep doing it, even immediately after we get burned. We keep doing it. We seem to forget that there are other ways to fight. So it's true, we're weak, ideologically, organizationally, and spiritually as workers. But the tragedy is, many union leaders believe our members are even weaker than they actually are. We lose faith in our members' ability to struggle, to grow, and to learn. We're so disconnected from the rich history of labor in this country, it's like we're unrecognizable. We're alienated from our past. We have this form of collective amnesia about labor history. It's like we're kind of embarrassed about it or in denial. So if our unions can't develop rudimentary class consciousness among our members around workplace issues, how are we going to ask our members to question the very fabric of what makes the world turn? That is, the undemocratic, harmful manner in which energy is created, stored, distributed, used, and controlled in our society. That's why the green jobs mantra is not enough, and that's why some unions feel compelled to partner with the fossil fuel industry. They simply don't see an alternative that permits their survival in the short term, and that is a challenge. It's such a cruel ultimatum that these companies put forth. If you think that your goal is to be grateful for crumbs, how are you going to think about winning long-lasting, meaningful victories and when it's not even on the table? Fighting the boss on the shop floor, or in our case in hospital units or clinics or offices, is the first step in awakening this dormant consciousness. Choosing direct action, involving workers in crafting their own vision of what a workplace should be, what their rights are regarding the quality of life, having the union be facilitator rather than fixer. These are the things that give our members the tools they need and the confidence that's essential to move on to the next step. If the members have no faith in the union, if they don't see it as an instrument of struggle in ways that affect them directly, they won't believe what we say, and they won't be motivated to do what's necessary around the bigger picture. So old-fashioned organizing is always the answer. Our own experience, we're a union in transformation. We just had a, I don't know, you call it a regime change? we had about 3.5 years ago, we had a formerly dissident caucus take over the union, and since then we've really changed things a lot. One of the things we found, we just did a successful struggle to get 18,000 nurses to take a strike vote in the city of New York. And we had a 95% of all membership voting for striking. That was pretty incredible. I'm not sure it meant they all really wanted to go out on strike, but they really enjoyed voting to do it. We've gotten a bunch of settlements with that pressure since then, and a couple that are still have handed in 10-day notices, but it did pressure the employer to do things the employer wouldn't do, and it was just this game of chicken. I know some of you have been involved in it. And, you know, getting a good contract is one of those incremental things. It's kind of like labor peace. You wonder about that. But they are seeing the bigger picture, because what we found is these Koch brothers, which everybody knows here who they are. The Koch brothers, who have moved into New York, they own a piece of New York Presbyterian Hospital, one of the biggest hospitals that we represent workers in. Basically we think was kind of bankrolling them. They were offering $10,000 a week. They were going to spend $10,000 a week per nurse to scab for the union. $10,000 per week was going to cost them. They had that lot of money. So what has NYSNA done around climate? We have a program to educate our members around climate change. It has a 4-point program. In our contracts, we do have continuing education language, and we've inserted all kinds of political stuff into that language. And we also are in the process of using it as an organizing tool, particularly for our younger nurses. We have a series of interactive classes where we link global warming to healthcare, because we're involved in healthcare and health crises. Many of us have been involved with disaster relief, and certainly see that link when we've gone to areas of disaster. I've gone to several, and so many of our nurses do that kind of volunteering. We've made efforts to hook up with communities that fight hydrofracking, polluting corporations, medical waste, filtration plants, and these actions provide more intimate meaning to our members as a segue to embracing the movement toward energy democracy as an outcome of that process, while understanding the need for coalescing with our surrounding communities. It's been a wonderful way to build that coalition. But we have a long way to go. Convincing members that issues of social justice, including energy democracy, are appropriate and essential components of what is a union is an ongoing process. Making these links every day between the oppression they deal with on the job and in their lives to the broader exploitation workers feel beyond their world is a new concept for some people, and they need to feel comfortable with taking responsibility for that leap of faith. But if we are not present and available to work side by side with our members, fighting the little battles and the bigger little battles, our credibility would be in the basement. You know, I was thinking I really couldn't make much of a contribution to this conference because to date we've just done such a small amount of work around the issue of climate change, specifically in our union. But my main message is more general. The development of militancy in the workplace and the culture of worker ownership of the union I believe is the overarching critical element in any trade union movement for social change. Thank you.
Next up is Bruce Hamilton, Vice President of Amalgamated Transit Union. Also want to recognize the Transport Workers Union people here, if they can just say who they are, because ATU and TWU opposed, the first unions to oppose the Keystone Pipeline. It was a very controversial decision, but they did it, and so they're part of this, I think, a new narrative around climate within the trade unions here.
The Amalgamated Transit Union represents about 190,000 members in the United States and Canada, almost all of which is in public transit, which is increasingly becoming private transit in a lot of locations. And so the effort to fight against privatization is one that's very dear to us. And like as Judy was saying, as the nurses did a few years ago, the ATU did also have a little bit of regime change, and we all got together behind our Larry Hanley was the leader of an insurgent group that did manage to gain control of the union a few years ago, and that has made it possible to engage in a lot of kind of stuff that really had been pretty much blocked up till that time. And I think it really shows another point that Judy made, which is that we often really underestimate our members and their ability to understand what they're really called to do in advancing unionism and advancing workers' rights. And so with this task, which starts out with the scientific approach, I think in the U.S. we've found up until really just a very few years ago, it's been extremely difficult to speak with our members and to try and make sense, to get sort of the members to understand the science of climate change in the way that they really internalized it or really understood what was going on. It was a lot of pushback, frankly, and I think everybody probably here understands that. That is just not the case at all anymore, as Osborne was saying earlier. That's just kind of, nobody has that discussion anymore, particularly here in New York City. After Sandy, it kind of like changed everybody's mind, but also all across the U.S. and Canada, our members have been, that's just not a discussion that you need to have with them anymore. It's what do we do about it now? And so it's really moved to a new level, and I think that the big problem with the leadership now is not really being bold enough in demanding of our members action and getting together and really forming concrete plans of what we're going to do to transform into a low-carbon, no-carbon economy. And so we've been doing we did a bunch of education in conjunction with Sean and his bunch, and leading up in particular to the People's Climate March last year. We actually had very good participation. All of our locals in New York and New Jersey showed up for the educational part before the event and got their members to come out to the march, and it really was a great moment in the ATU, and we all impressed each other with how much we did there, because we're a very, very conservative group. And to the point earlier about not trying to talk about left-right, it isn't necessary really to do that at all, but to advance trade unionism and advance the workers' democracy really is something that comes natural to workers, even if you think they're really very conservative. Internationalism is also something that the ATU, of course, the U.S. and Canada, we work very closely together, but also ATU is an affiliate of the International Transport Workers Federation, and they've developed a really great model to talk about transport in conjunction with climate change, and it basically boils down to three words, which is reduce, shift, and improve. And the reduce part, Osborne covered a little bit earlier today, and the need to reduce overall transport, which is the second leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions. But the second part we fall really naturally into, which is shift from high carbon modes of transport to low carbon modes. And that's where public transit really comes in a big way. And this last report from the scientists from the United Nations, which really made very few very specific recommendations, said that one of the things that's absolutely necessary if we're going to start reversing climate change is for the public to invest hugely in mass transit and develop infrastructure that is that's going to be it's going to provide low carbon transportation to people. And so it's something that our members have embraced really, and we've got some pretty bold programs we think that are going to take that even further. One thing that the ATU did was assume control of the National Labor College campus in Silver Spring, Maryland, and we're in the process now of converting it into, well, not really converting it, making it work really. And the primary goal of the place is to have a training ground for union activists, and that includes environmental activists and all sorts of progressive groups, as well as just labor. It's not just for the ATU, but to have a place where people can undertake the skills to learn the skills necessary for real social transformation. So we're very excited about that. And another thing that our members have embraced, maybe not as much as we'd really want them to, but they're trending in that direction, is organizing our passengers. And as Larry Hanley is fond of saying, there are far more public transit riders than there are members of the National Rifle Association. Yet Congress is afraid of the National Rifle Association, but they're not afraid of transit riders. Why is that? That's something that... sorry. No, yeah, right. Anyway. Edit that in the film. All right. Well, I'll try not to quote Larry too much more, I guess. But we have been engaged in that, and the other one of the big things we're trying to do right now is turn around something that's been going on for the last almost a generation in Washington D.C. As private industry failed to be able to carry people to and from work, they turned the infrastructure basically over to various governments and authorities, and around the Washington D.C. Baltimore area, they established the Washington Area Metropolitan Transit Authority, which did run all the transit throughout that system, and now, little by little, they've been privatizing bits of that, and in almost every instance where they've privatized, it's a foreign company that has come in, usually a French company or a British company that has come in to operate the transit system in our nation's capital, which is ironic a little bit, I guess. But and of course, the entire point of privatizing, as we all know, is to drive down the wages of workers. So we've been on a campaign to try and reverse that, to bring all the work back into public control, and it's going to be a long project. Very it involves an incredible amount of stuff that you wouldn't even really think about. But we're forming alliances with community organizations and with religious organizations and other people that and people that rely on public transit to try and improve the transit there. And what we're really trying to do is to we haven't got very far with this, but to work with planner types to envision what the Washington D.C. metropolitan area would look like if public transit were so readily available and so attractive an option that nobody would even think of driving their car to or from work, and then really pushing for the kind of funding that would be necessary to make that a reality. That's a project that our members can understand, and it's a very sort of concrete thing that we can lay the plans for and then develop the public support for and move forward into really that kind of transformation that will also bring much greater democracy in that process. So that's just some of what we're doing.
Thanks, Bruce. Well done. Great, great, great. Next, we got Chris Erickson, business manager of International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 3, that represents 35,000 members, I think, Chris, in this region, in the energy sector and other sectors. So Chris has played a big role in the People's Climate March, and he represents workers in an industry which is right at the heart of this debate. So, Chris, over to you.
Hi, Sean. Sean, what am I doing here? Huh? I'm the IBW. We build powerhouses, you know? The building trades, build pipelines, you know? What am I doing here, Sean? Tree huggers, you know? Come on. Actually, I'm happy to be here with so many people of good conscience, and I applaud you all. I want to start by, again, I'm the business manager of Local 3 of the IBW, a national union, an international union with branches in Canada and the Panama Canal Zone. Our structure, like most international unions, is structured. We are a chartered local of the international, and we live under the bylaws and the Constitution. And, of course, of all the politics that exist in every organization. So, emphatically, I want to be clear that I do not speak on behalf of the IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. In fact, we just transitioned our international president, Edwin D. Hill, stepped down, and we have a new president. And Ed Hill was quite supportive of me in New York in doing some things that were a little out there. And so I've got a new guy in Washington, and of course the politics of all that will prevail, and I'll find out soon enough where I am. It's a little complicated, as you know. The IBW represents 200,000 members in the utilities, and many of them in coal-fed power plants. And all in all, the IBW represents employees in basically 83% of the organized utilities in the United States and Canada, 70% of the organized investor-owned utilities, 96% of the rural organized electric cooperative utilities, 76% of the organized municipal utilities, and 100% of all organized federal government utilities. Now, I don't really know how many that is. It sounds impressive, and there are 200,000, but I don't know how many are organized today. Regulation started in California as soon as Ronald Reagan was elected, as did the move for a union-free environment in the United States, and that was 1980. So this has been a 35-year battle that the trade union movement in the United States has been in, and I would tell you, like Judy said, we're not winning the battle, and labor is in some pretty tough straits here in the United States. The IBW has its policies listed on the web regarding energy, utilities, nuclear. They've embraced advanced coal electric generation with carbon capture and storage. That's a safe bet for an international president. Again, the IBW supports a balanced transition from carbon-based fuels, but the reality is that trade union leaders have to get elected, and they have to be responsive to the members, and of course, that makes it not an easy task. New York, however, is a little different, and we have a little latitude. I supported and participated in the climate march, and that was a big issue. The building trades department of the AFL-CIO in Washington pretty much took the position to not support that march in New York City. and it was probably directly over Keystone. And I just could not, in good conscience, not. After what we saw here in New York with the devastation of Sandy, which was so telling that, we must act. And again, I had the support of the international president. I told him it's my gut. I got to be there, Ed. Our members need to be there, and we went. And so labor's divided. Yeah. And I liked the remarks this morning. I wasn't sure if it was only the women in France that go to work. You said that they go to, their work is during the day, but they're citizens at night. Was it just the women, or was it the men too? You don't recall saying that? I wrote it down. I did. You said they go to work. The job is important during the day, but at night they go home and they're citizens and they do everything, and then they realize climate change has to be addressed. And so I would hope the men are doing the same thinking. But it's the same thing in America. It's really, it's an economic fight, and people are torn. It's about my job or the planet, and we have to work on that. People in the United States are distracted today. Kim Kardashian is a big deal. American Idol on TV, more people voted for American Idol than they did for the president of the United States in one of our elections. I mean, that is distracted, and it's not getting any better. Judy mentioned it. I believe the collective social conscience of America has clearly been corrupted. And the trade unions have a job in front of them to convince their own members, many of their own members, because of what they see on TV. And they talk about the Koch brothers and how they can formulate the issues on Fox TV. And it's repeated, and the politicians repeat it, and your members hear it over and over, and they start to believe it. And so, people also feel helpless. I mean, what more do you want me to do? I recycle, Sean. I got a yellow can and a blue can. How much more do they want you to do here? People do feel helpless. How can you save the planet? But I want to tell you real fast, in New York, the green economy agenda has been embraced. We partnered with the U.S. Green Buildings Council. We instruct a program called G-Pro with over 1,000 apprentices have received that. That's green install training, new types of installations. And the Emerald Cities is a program you're going to hear about on the next panel. The IBW did get in on that early on. It's an important green initiative. Sandy rebuild. Hundreds and hundreds of homes are being rebuilt in New York City under a PLA that FEMA is paying for. They're using building trades, and they're putting all new energy efficiencies into these homes. That's a big deal. That's an initiative, a public initiative on a pretty big scale. As far as the union goes, and to the effort of what we need to do internally, we're organizing our own members for political action. We have a young worker initiative that basically the young workers can relate to the issue of climate change and global warming. They know it. They know this is their future. Educating our membership on climate change. I don't think a newspaper has gone out from the organization in the last couple of months that hasn't had some article on climate change. And so it is somewhat overwhelming, but we can make a difference. Local 3 is a strong militant union. We organize, and we help those less fortunate inside and outside of the labor movement. And my union is in a unique position because we're well integrated into both the public, the private, and the building trade sectors of the trade union movement, and we have a seat at the table. So if I'm the only guy here in this room, trust me, this message is being relayed back at the Central Labor Council and at the building trades and at the public employee table because it's important. I carry the message, and we encourage others to align with community groups, given that that it's clear that we need each other. Trade union movement's not going to do this alone in New York City. But politically, we are here today in New York. We may have an opportunity to transition clearly to renewables, to some more things. We want to save the carriage horses for the Teamsters. Oh, there she is. The Teamsters are in the back. That's a big issue in New York City. I don't know. The mayor got elected. He said he's getting rid of the carriage horses and, tough stuff. No, Sean, I've been accused of being a hypocrite over how could I be for climate change and not support, this thing about the animal products, eating meat and things like that. People have really put me in a box on this. And I said, what does that have to do with climate change? They said, cows fart. They fart methane gas. And so that and the fact that they take forests down and defoliate and hurt indigenous people, and I'm really getting pressed here, I mean, something about a hamburger that, you come from New York, it's just, it's there. It's going to be tough. But I think politically, Sean, we do have an opportunity to do some things in New York, whether it's the public, taking over some of the power generation in New York City. It may be time. It clearly may be an opportunity, and hopefully we'll see that happen. So, thanks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris. Always great. Always great. We all needed a little bit of a laugh. Anyway, come on. Fernando Lozada, Nurses United.
Don, thanks to all the organizers and to all of you. I'll be brief because the next panel is going to be good, and we're almost at the bewitching hour.
Yeah. What are you trying to say, man?
I'm saving the best for last. We're good, but they're better. So want to speak a little bit about what our union has done over the past few years on the environmental and climate justice front, and talk a little bit how we see this fitting into the broader social movement and the labor movement in the United States, as my colleagues have done. As far as I'm from the National Nurses United. We're a union of 185,000 registered nurses in hospitals across the United States. So we're very well positioned in communities throughout the country to provide a voice, a progressive voice on all kinds of social issues. Traditionally, of course, we've been real advocates for public health. That makes sense. But really our MO, our modus operandi in all this work around environmental and climate justice, which we've been very outspoken on over the past few years, is exactly making that linkage between health, individual health, and collective health. And certainly our members understand it, and I believe society at large understands it. So we've really made an effort, number one, to change the narrative, and certainly in terms of our engagement as a union in environmental and climate justice work, to talk about it not necessarily in scientific terms, but to talk about it as a threat to health, and to make the link to with people, our own members and the community, that when we struggle or that the struggle for environmental and climate justice is a struggle for human health and well-being, so that when we're fighting for environmental justice, we're fighting cancer, we're fighting lung disease, we're fighting hunger, we're fighting infectious diseases around the world, we're fighting poverty. And we find that it is very effective. So when we join with the environmental justice movement as a union, we find that can be, it's often our greatest contribution. I mean, frankly, speaking amongst ourselves who are involved in this movement, when we speak when we talk about parts per million, when we talk about particulate matter and NOx emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, people's eyes glaze over. It's kind of mystifying. So when you can talk about it in terms of children with leukemia or asthma by the power plant, it makes a big difference. And when we're in public events, right, and we're out there in the streets, we talk about these things, this is what tends to get the public's attention. So certainly it's been effective for us in our engagement in the movement, and I would, I always talk to comrades in the environmental and climate justice movements and encourage them to do the same, because we find it really gets people's attention, it gets the media's attention. The other key aspect, of course, is member engagement, and everybody's talked about that. And I don't think we do anything magical there, but I'll just outline some of the things. Number one, of course, is, as I said, linking individual health care, which is what our members do, to the greater questions of the collective assault on health of people, health of communities, health of the planet. Our members get it, and I find that other people get it, other workers get it when we talk about it. And so I don't think it's a surprise that my colleagues here with me and many of you in the room, we're not necessarily from the energy sector per se. We're in services. So where we interact with people, we can make these connections because it's about quality of life, and I think it's a very direct connection. As Brother Fletcher said in an article recently, it may be an easier lift for healthcare workers to make this linkage, but I think we can all find ways to make this linkage. Certainly the bus drivers have very effectively, and others. Building services, I mean, there's many examples. Utility workers have done some real good work on that too. So that we have to figure out how to make that link, and that's how we've done it. The other thing, of course, is basic education, getting out to the work sites, getting to our committee meetings, going to all our conventions and regional meetings, and doing basic education on climate, as Sister Judy was talking about they do, we and others, and we certainly do that too. And there, the role of TUED has been formidable, and the support of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation has been key. If you're not tapping them, I really encourage you to do that. The materials are fantastic, and it's really resonated with our membership, and it's really helped boost our work. The other key component is some level of internal organization around this question. Again, nothing secret here, but we have really what I find is in any work site, any hospital where you have a couple hundred people working or more, there's always going to be somebody that cares about and is informed on environmental and climate justice. They're there. They may not even be active in the union, but they're there. If you can find them, engage them, give them a forum to participate, they can become active. And we've done just that. We've created a national working group. It's a bit of a study group and a forum for activists. We meet monthly on conference calls and Skype throughout the union, and it's an ability to share experience, collectivize our struggle, learn from each other, and continue those examples. And then those folks represent local units of the union, and they go and they speak to what's going on, not only what they're doing, but what's going on around the country, and share some of that work, some of those experiences, and hopefully inspire others to act. It's been a very healthy process. The other absolutely key aspect is engagement in local environmental justice struggles. And this is in partnering with other organizations that are already out there doing that work. So for example, Gaia around incinerators, Sierra Club around issues like fracking and air quality in particular, local chapters, Friends of the Earth, Food and Water Watch, 350.org, all these organizations that are, we all know that the environmental justice movement is somewhat fragmented, works in different places. And so as a union, wherever there's an overlay, we try to find something we can plug into. And again, it's relatively easy for us as nurses to go, and we're always welcome because we can speak to the human impacts and support those struggles. So we've been involved in around local fracking issues, urban drilling in the cities, particularly in places like Los Angeles, fighting refinery expansions, particularly for tar sands processing, fighting the oil trains. There's a big fight brewing in the central coast of California. They want to build a rail spur to get your tar sands, sorry, not yours, get those tar sands out. Always going after those arteries, as she said. So, well, a good medical analogy. Fighting waste incinerators, as I mentioned, open, uncovered pet coke piles in urban areas like we're doing now in Chicago. opposing, joining with coalitions to oppose new LNG terminals, like the one in Texas, on the Gulf Coast of Texas they want to build to get that fracked gas out overseas, and the coal terminals, the export terminals, like the one in Long Beach, California, crude by rail projects, et cetera, et cetera. We're involved in all these things, and there's nurses going and supporting those movements. It's not the union per se leading it, but it's the union engaging it. The nurses, the members participate. They become more active. They share the experience. Has a very, very positive and cumulative effect. So, on another key aspect of engagement is engaging the national union as much as possible. And this is where, again, the nurse voice can be very helpful. So, for example, our opposition to the KXL pipeline, I think, was helpful because the, as been alluded to here, the general consensus among, and you know, the overall voice out there and perception is that labor has been supports these pipeline infrastructure projects, and that has been the history. The same thing for example, some of the progressive work that's been done, and there has been some good progressive work, I'll say, from the federal government, from the EPA, on power plant rules. There's coming ozone rules. These are good things. We want to support these types of things. And then some of the political struggles nationally or on the state level around fracking, for example, states like California, North Carolina, Maryland, where we just succeeded in getting a fracking moratorium, which was an important victory. Places like Illinois, where they're trying to open up the state to fracking, where there's a good union presence. Internationally now, this is a big challenge. This is a challenge for all of us to try to gain that, to build the movement internationally within our sectors. To do that, we have formed a network of progressive nurse unions around the world called Global Nurses United. It's in its infancy. It has three pillars, really, that unite the various unions. One, of course, is healthcare as a human right. Two is resisting austerity, particularly in the healthcare sector. And three is the fight against climate disruption as the single greatest threat to public health and health systems in human history. So it's both an offensive and a defensive program. And through this network, then, we're able to share experiences, share some of the information, the science. For example, one of our international meetings, TUED was there. We were able to share some of the experience in terms of the health impacts and then making those connections now on an international level. Fantastic meeting in Lima that our comrades here from the Water Workers Union facilitated with the nurses there. And we find that there's a general understanding and consensus among, certainly among the nurses, around the threat that we're facing, how it impacts healthcare and healthcare systems and the health of humanity. So there's a real good organizing platform there. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think there's fertile soil to cultivate there. Now, how is all this work situated within the United States? Bruce and Chris referred to this. And what we find is that really the greatest obstacle is an ideological problem. There are national unions. Most of them espouse what we might call a partnership philosophy, whereby the unions promote the business agenda of the employers as a primary goal. It is their modus operandi. What's good for the employer's business then accrues to the members, right? We're all familiar with that. There's some extreme cases, particularly when you come to things like the KXL pipeline, frankly. So within the AFL, this is a formidable obstacle, and National Nurses United finds itself as part of a small minority of progressive unions taking a different position, along with our comrades in the ATU and a couple others. We really find difficult overcoming that obstacle. But there is a good side. And that is that, and I guess within the scheme of things you have to look for the positive, and that is that there's no longer a pro-industry consensus coming from the American Federation of Labor on climate questions. That I think that is a very positive thing that we should all take heart, particularly in the United States. A minority can achieve that. We can at least neutralize the very negative effects of some of the opposition, and that is a strategic role to play. So, for example, in the last COP meeting, the COP 20, there was no pro-industry statement from the AFL-CIO, which is, you know, within the scheme of things, I think is an achievement. Obviously, we need to go beyond that, but neutralizing a negative is an important step forward. But I think the really good news, and I'll wrap it up, the really good news was really evidenced here in New York, and this has also been alluded to by my colleagues from New York. The Hurricane Sandy experience, I think, had a real transformative role. It changed the whole dialogue within the labor movement. The presence in the climate march from the New York labor unions was formidable and notably included many unions whose parent national bodies, like the ones I was talking to at the AFL, are either not supportive of a progressive climate agenda or on the wrong side of it, yet they were here taking a bold position, really in opposition to their parent unions. That is a very significant development. So I guess the conclusion here is that sometimes we just need to be hit over the head, you know, frankly, before we begin to take a broader view, get out of our paradigms and make a shift, in this case to go beyond the false contradiction between climate justice and jobs and economic growth. And I think that it's safe to say, this is common sense, that as we experience more Sandys and Katrinas, the opportunities to build this movement will grow, certainly within the labor movement. So that our leadership now, as a progressive trade union minority, is vital. So that if we continue to educate, agitate, and organize, as the effects of climate disruption continue to manifest themselves, and of course they will, we will be soon the majority, and I trust a sufficient force to transform society.
Thanks, Fernando. We've got a few minutes of Q&A, and then we're going to move straight away to the final session where we're going to hear from some other movement leaders just to sum up the day, and then at 5 o'clock we have a reception. So please hang in for the beer. I just want to, before I call on people, thank a few people, because that often gets done at the end when everybody's running for the elevator or the bar. I want to mention Elena Mora there, who's been working tirelessly on this. I got it when I moved over to Murphy. I got an email from Elena saying, "I hear about the new program. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life." So I said, "Well, give up the rest of your life right now." So anyway, also Carly Joe and Sarah for their help with the prezzies. They put the presentations together. Gina Hong, who works with Trade Unions for Energy Democracy here, but making sure well organized. And Stephanie and James from Rosa Luxemburg, you both know. James did a lot of work getting people here. And lastly, CUNY TV. Hopefully we'll have a good, nice, beautiful video to share to give to the world when that's done. Union members, CUNY TV. And of course, the staff of 32BJ and Lenore for her support with the work we're doing. So let's open it up a little bit. I'm going to call on Colin because he's come all the way from Australia, and I'm going to call JJ, and I'll come back over to John and Jamie.
In Australia, you can drive a truck in a outback coal mine and earn $160,000 a year doing it, which is a fair bit of money. I presume you have a similar problem in the US, where you've got to persuade people in good unionised jobs to take a leap of faith into the green economy, where the jobs may not be anywhere near as well paid. How are you dealing with that issue? And just one other quick question. Is there much, we haven't heard anything yet today, but is the issue of divestment from fossil fuel companies come up in the US trade union movement?
Thanks much for the panel. I really appreciate all your remarks. I want to talk briefly about democracy. First of all, we understand that given our two-party system, democracy in our nation is really crippled. But I think that's also reflected in our trade union movement. To a large degree, our trade union movement represents a smaller and smaller percentage of the U.S. population and our electorate. First of all, I think when we talk about our trade union movement, we should talk about not just the organized trade union movement, but those unions that are outside the mainstream. In other words, alternative unions. And I think to a large degree, one of the big issues we have is how do we raise consciousness? How do we take our membership and move them from A to B? And generally that happens, the best way to do that, the best time to do that is when your members are in motion. One of the problems is that to a large degree, a lot of our members, as has the U.S. electorate, they've pretty much opted out of the system for many reasons. I mean, we mentioned that more people vote for, was it Dancing with the Stars or American Idol? I don't know. I get them confused. Dancing with the Stars. Well, anyway, to a large degree, there are thousands or even millions of people in motion. But I think to a large degree, our labor movement has become so siloed that so many of those folks in motion we're not in touch with. And I'm talking to a large degree, those communities that have generally been outside of the mainstream, communities of color, a lot of the women's movements, etc. So I think one of the things I'd like to ask folks, to what degree are we talking about democracy in our unions and in our society and trying to use those to build a movement and to build a climate movement that would be broader than what we have now? And when we talk about labor, we're not talking about the traditional labor movement.
Forster and then Jamie.
Yeah, hi. John Forster from DC 37, which is a public service union, of course, representing 121,000 workers here in New York City. Our headquarters were flooded for 10 months as a result of Sandy, and yet it has still been hard to get the traction among the rank and file. I really want to thank the panel for a lot of really great things that were said. The rank and file education piece has been absolutely essential. And frankly, if there's some additional pointers on that, I'm open to hearing that stuff from all of you. Obviously, also the linking that we're not just talking about jobs. And I think Judy, you said this, that it can't just be a green jobs mantra, that it has to be connected with other issues as well. And one of those, of course, that emerges is the environmental justice issue, and that in turn has to be linked to the economic justice, but as JJ said also, the racial justice issue, because those are all together, and I think we have to constantly bring those back together. And then I guess the other piece, and maybe this is a question, is building that larger movement. We have a lot of different efforts going on here in New York City to try to expand that beyond just labor, to include environmental justice, environmental organizations, faith organizations, and CBOs. But if people have thoughts about how we can do a better job on that, because, this is great, we bring this together, but in the end, we need to really build an incredibly huge, broad-based, powerful social movement if we're going to change where we're going. Thank you.
A lot of people are, all of us here are aware of the XL pipeline, but I think less people are aware of some other pipelines. I think the tar sands for us in the United States, they may not be as dirty, but they're wreaking environmental havoc all over this country as shale gas wells and the infrastructure to transport those fracked gases. And 160 miles from where I stand right now, there are not one but two pipelines to bring fractured gas across the state of New York. Governor Cuomo is very proud of the fact that he called for ban, at least temporarily, of fracking gas in New York, but we are transporting, or we plan to transport frack gas from Pennsylvania and other places right to the west of the Catskill Mountains, along the Susquehanna Valley, and probably about 10 miles from a NISNA bargaining unit. I have a house in Franklin where they're planning to build an 80,000 horsepower compressor to help transport that gas. There have been communities that have been trying to organize against this infrastructure. They have recently started to form coalitions. The hearings that have been put on by FERC and DEC and so on, they have these communities. These are working class people. I wouldn't say they're naturally anti-union people, but when they see union people, they're bussed in. The building trades unions are bussed in, and that's their experience with unions right here in the state of New York. And I guess my question is, what can we do, to right here in our own backyard, to give support to the movements that are building in the state of New York to keep gas infrastructure from taking over?
Gloria at the back.
Thanks to the panel, but particularly the nurses' unions. I'm not a nurse, but I am a frontline public health worker, and my hospital and my patients in the hospital itself were pretty severely affected by Hurricane Sandy. And so I think you're right when you say that there's an opportunity, an opening here to talk, to connect health, to talk to people about children's health, about our community health. But there's also an opening, which I'm concerned about, we should all be concerned about, and how should we address this, of the rebuilding that's still going on or not going on. We can look at what's happening in New Orleans. So there's the developer, there's, the politicians connected to the developers taking land. A lot of the communities that were affected are going to be wiped out, and there's going to be different kind of development. I don't know how we make this connection, but for one example, in the Rockaways, which is still really struggling, that's a NYCHA housing project that they have designated to do this kind of privatization project. And so, how do we, I guess similar to what John said, how do we connect those struggles and those local struggles here?
I'm with 350.org, and from our perspective, all these groups played a huge role in the People's Climate March, and many here, I remember, I think it was just over a year ago, where we had our first press conference in Times Square, and Chris came out and spoke, and there were only about 40 people there, and basically no press. And I think we were all a little bit worried about how things would turn out. So it was thanks to the role that labor really played in that march that turned that into such a transformative moment. So thank you all so much. My question is, we're gearing up for another election. It feels like from today there's been a conversation that we lack some specificity in our demands, that there isn't a common understanding about what the transition to this new economy is going to look like, and certainly isn't a part of the political discussion. We know that green jobs won't cut it as the slogan. What's your perspective on what we could be putting forward for candidates, for the media, for others to really adopt, so that we can use the election as a chance to actually have a deeper and more focused conversation in this country about the transition that we really need to see?
Thank you very much for this session. I mean, it's interesting for us as well from the other side of the Atlantic to see what is being said here. I also wanted a very brief right of reply to our colleague Christopher. If we gave the impression that only women worked in France, that's definitely not the case. I mean, it must have been my English. There are more men working in France than women, and unfortunately women generally work in far more precarious situation, in far more precarious jobs than men do. However, once they leave the office or their workplace, I would say, and I'm sure most of my sisters here would agree, that given our capacity to be multitask, we end up being far better at looking after the climate than possibly some men I could quote.
I agree.
Brother over there.
I enjoyed the comments, but I found one comment extremely interesting, that there's sort of a movement of labor to the climate movement after Sandy, and Katrina was far worse. So why did it take? I'm a New Yorker, but why did it take Sandy and not Katrina? And what's changed in during the time?
Here, and then Jean, you're the last on this session.
Hi, I'm Ruth Silverberg. I'm from the Professional Staff Congress, and I teach teachers, and I live on Staten Island. And I have bad news for you. They're not making the connection. They don't think it has anything to do with climate change. And it's really tough, because I teach teachers, and I'm trying to educate people, but we need a lot of help getting education to Staten Island, which, as you know, is the most conservative borough, and people do not want to understand that that's what it is. They're concerned about the rebuilding, but they're concerned about rebuilding just so that they have a place to live, not because they're concerned about what kind of rebuilding it is. And they're not getting the connections to Katrina at all. And the potential for privatization in the current circumstances on Staten Island, and the health issues that the children in their schools are experiencing, that they have not made the connection. And we really need help educating people on Staten Island, because the biggest victims don't get it.
For that, Ruth. Jean, you're the final one, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Gene Carroll. I co-direct the Union Leadership Institute at Cornell's Worker Institute. I spoke briefly before. Just a brief comment. I've been in the labor movement for 41 years, and I can remember back when the Cold War was in its prime, and if you raised the question about maybe nuclear weapons are not a good idea to keep building more of them. You know, Churchill said, how many times do we need the rubble to bounce? And Lane Kirkland, the head of the AFL-CIO, was on a group called the Committee on the Present Danger. You couldn't get more right-wing than that. They were in favor of building hundreds of thousands of more nuclear weapons. Deep thinkers. So for this group, from the Local 3 to a nurses organization to ATU, you represent construction workers, public sector workers, and private sector workers. This is really a little comment by me that's saying this is a good example that you're providing. And I would like to see this group, if not the same people, the same mix of people with the same attitude. And I know this is complicated for Chris, but as a director of a leadership institute, we all know the same thing. We teach our kids the most important thing about leadership development is leading by example. Taking on a complicated question that you know is bigger and affects the interest of your members. I don't want to, I can't overemphasize how important this is. This is a democratic discussion. It's about what are you talking about across unions? Membership, mobilization, and education. This has been if you critique the labor movement in the last 2 generations, one critique is we demobilized. I did a paper on the Vietnam War where I read a quote from George Meany where he talked about we don't need to organize immigrants and new people. We're strong enough. And I thought if the impact of leadership, that thinking infected people and it harmed us. And Meany did some good stuff, civil rights law that he helped pass in 64 and 65. But talking about mobilizations, demonstrating your leadership by engaging in this discussion, by putting on the table the complications this is for your members, all of you. Talking about the fact that you were in a union that 3 years ago went through its own internal revolution, as did ATU. Oh my God, we come from a union tradition where if you're not a union leader for 35 years, something's wrong with you. So this is a good thing. Now, partly we're in a big crisis in the labor movement in America. We know this. But I want to celebrate and underscore the importance of leadership. And, I'm sitting here thinking, I don't want to get up here and pick apart all the things that are wrong in the world. There's some good things, and this is a really good one. We just need to do more of it to have this discussion. And that's it.
On that note, thank you, Gene. And let's take a couple of minutes, stretch our legs, and we'll come back for the final half hour or so for the closing session, and then we'll have a beer and whatever. Oh, I'm so sorry, guys.
You don't want to answer questions.
I
wrote them all down.
I'm so sorry that
I don't want to answer any of them, Sean, but I want to just make two comments.
No, that's my fault. That wasn't intentional.
You can do that. This is a big week in the United States. I mean, Obamacare and marriage equality by the Supreme Court in the United States. That is a big deal. What's next, Sean? Climate change? What do you think? My grandfather asked a question. He was a trade unionist in New York City for a long time. When are people going to join the human race? Was the question that he asked when he was involved at a level with so many. And that's an important question because that has to really happen. On the issue of immigration, and I know it's a little off topic, but immigration, the issue in the United States, it's going to be a one that divides the trade union movement in this next election. They're going to put that out there as immigration is bad, and union workers are going to grasp that. Like anything that they want to put out there is an impediment to, vote your own economic interests, and including, the fight for climate change. But there are a number of things here. If I can get a $160,000 job driving a truck in Alaska, I might go. After this amount of time in New York City in the labor movement, in the fight, I'm ready to drive a truck in Australia. I got to tell you, it'd be not a bad job. But you're right, hard, very difficult to get guys to give up those type of jobs, and say we're going to shut this plant. There's got to be a transition to good jobs, union jobs. That's what it's got to be, and that's a fight. It's hard enough fighting for union jobs now to transition out when something as big as this is going to happen. It's going to be a real fight. As far as the non-traditional labor movement, things are happening. The building trades are with community groups. The mayor of New York City pledged 200,000 affordable housing apartments, and the building trades can't do that alone, and the community needs the work opportunity. And so there are new alliances being built in New York City at a place where they were never there before, and that's important. And I think having the opportunity to be in the room with them broadens the experience and the conversation. So I think that's important as well. As far as the pipelines coming in to New York on the frack gas stuff, it's the same thing with the power. The governor wants to close the powerhouses in Western New York and plug the extension cord into Canada. No disrespect to my Canadian brothers, and run that cord right down the Hudson River. And I have a little bit of a personal issue with that. I think we need to do something different. Not that I'm. The Canadians haven't won the Stanley Cup in a little while, and I know they're a little jealous, but plugging our power into your outlet in the middle of Canada is an issue for me as an electrical worker anyway, and so we got the gold medal, And as far as the transition on the election, what else in the election? Oh boy, Donald Trump. Could you imagine climate change goes down the tubes if Donald Trump becomes he's like just unbelievable what he said about, Mexicans in his coming out speech. The guy just disparaged, and the unfortunate thing is there are people in America that were happy to hear him say that. That's the split that is a big problem, and that's not only within the inside the trade union movement, but it's outside. So, and Sandy. The last thing on Sandy was, what's the difference, Katrina and Sandy? Katrina was down south. Sandy was 5 feet of water in your living room and your house, and that damage was real. We had thousands of members of Local 3 impacted by Sandy, and it kind of brought it home. When it's not you or in your backyard, you know, it's less important. When it hits you right between the eyes, then you pay attention. So that's, I think, was the wake-up call here in New York. So thank you.
I want to respond to JJ's question about members in motion. I think that you have to have a lot of courage and be willing to take risks. We found that once we took over, we realized that people were afraid of everything, and they just kind of went along, kind of plodding along with whatever was dished out to them. So we tried to wake up that spirit in people of saying something's wrong with what they're doing to me and to what I do. So we just started doing these kind of direct action things. Even our last contract fight, we said, what's the contract? It's really what happens every day. So we've done things that I can't believe they tried to deny access to our representatives. We mobbed the CEO, terrorized him. We had a bullying manager. We mobbed her, and she accused us of kidnapping. We didn't kidnap her, but we surrounded her. When we took over the cafeteria, I've never seen nurses do that. 60 of us just moved into the cafeteria, took it over.
Women, be careful. Be afraid.
Especially.
Be very afraid.
When you wake it up. And what Fernando was talking about, creating a new paradigm, letting people, say, no, this is wrong, this is idiotic, this is absurd, I'm not going to do this, this doesn't make sense. Why do I have to do this? This is not right. So when people think, when they don't get struck dead, when they do stuff like that, or, and actually get somewhere, because when they denied access, after we did those 2 actions, it was like, don't ask, don't tell. I asked security, I said, you going to arrest us? And they said, they don't know what they're doing. I'm not, so, or we had another issue where they tried to ban us in another facility, and one of our nurses put on a disguise. She put on a wig and glasses and went in, and they surrounded her. They said they were going to arrest her. We had a press conference, and the headline was, hospital tries to arrest nurses talking about safe patient care. The whole community was, you just have to, people have fun. You have to have fun. Getting our members to get excited and happy, and what I was talking about, this spiritual unionism, what is the union? The union is my tool. It's not my fixer. It's not my benefit producer. It's a tool. This contract's a tool. Everything's a tool, but I have to do the work. And we have, in my hospital, the last contract where we had we have 250 stewards, never were stewards before. Activists that came through. We had people volunteering hours and days. I had a nurse who never did anything. She said, I'm going to help you go around, but I can only go from 7:30 to 8. 10:30, she's saying, where are we going next? And I'm coming tomorrow. They get so excited about talking to each other. So I think those things really matter, because if people think they can beat back their own boss, then they think that maybe something else is possible. So I think member mobilization is everything and everywhere, and just what's the issue in it? There's always issues. And that's what we've learned, that on the spot thing. And just something about Staten Island. I did relief work in Rockaway and Staten Island. Staten Island's rough, man. I don't, we have people doing a lot of on-the-ground work there, and Pat Kane is our person that you may have heard of her. She's done a lot of stuff and really built coalitions that have been very important. But there's this thing there that's different. I've done work. I feel for you. I don't know what. It's a really tough. It's a tough place.
Just very quickly on a couple of the other questions that have gone unanswered. On the question of divestment, in addition to the church institutions, universities, and the like, those types of institutions which I think are universal opportunities to forward the divestment movement, in the United States we have a real opportunity in the healthcare sector, particularly the hospital industry. The majority of hospitals in this country, small majority, are still private. They're still nonprofit. They are private nonprofits, many with church affiliations, and so they're very vulnerable. It's also interesting to note that for most of the last several years, those hospital corporations have made more on their investment portfolios than on hospital operations. That's the way healthcare functions in the United States. So we have a great opportunity, and I think we're going to see some advances in that, especially if we, healthcare sector unions, push them on it. We will, and we're working with 350 on that in NNU. On the question that was raised about Katrina, which is a good question, I'll just say a little bit of our experience, collective experience as a union on that, which might serve as a partial answer. Katrina was 10 years ago. I think in the last 10 years, the climate movement has advanced a lot, which I think it's important to take stock of that. There's a lot more consciousness about it. We sent many nurses, several dozen nurses, to Katrina to provide assistance to those besieged hospitals and those besieged hospital workers in New Orleans. We thought we were doing relief work, support work. What we later realized, we didn't know we were doing this at the time, what we later realized is what we were climate first responders. And now when we look back on it, we realize that that's when our climate justice work began, during Katrina. Another factor, it is the South. It's non-union territory. In New York, this is union country. It's a very union-dense environment, one of the most union-dense environments in the country. So the coalescence, the intersection of the climate justice movement and the labor movement really came to the fore in New York, and I think exhibits the real potential that we have.
Yeah. Okay, I'd really like to hear the next panel, but I can't resist making at least one comment on this, and that's about Staten Island. I just respectfully like to disagree with you. One thing I'd like to point out about Staten Island is Larry Hanley is from Staten Island, and but you should talk to some ATU members out there because you know it really is our members, and they have the reputation of being the most conservative members in the ATU. But really, when you think about it, what could possibly be more conservative than trying to preserve human life on the planet, really?